They called it Hemswick Logistics because it sounded respectable on the invoices. Inside, it smelled of cardboard, old coffee, and the faint, persistent ghost of someone's experimental glue. The plaster ceiling was patchworked with fluorescent fixtures that flickered when the rain got theatrical. The small, mismatched crew who worked the night shift called it worse things, but the company paid the bills, which was something fewer and fewer of them appreciated. Bixby Wren, Bix to everyone, was the sort of man who could find a joke in a hazard sign. He wore a battered high-vis vest like a superhero cape and drove the forklift like an unlicensed therapist, authoritative, loud, and entirely unqualified. Corliss Penhale, a narrow-faced man with hair like a broom that had given up, arranged pallets with the sort of meticulous resentment usually reserved for tax forms. Zadie Merritt, a short and acerbic woman, cataloged returns with the slow efficiency of someone who'd already traveled to hell and found the Wi-Fi terrible. Orson Fable, soft-eyed and endlessly distracted, stacked boxes with the reverence of someone resolving a poem in his head. Nettle Hawk, Net, kept the scanners and the crew's tiny, surreptitious internet economy running. If something went missing, Net knew where to look because she'd bookmarked the route. Their manager, Gideon Crass, had a face that suggested he'd swallowed all the small joys of the world and started to glare. Gideon enjoyed policies the way others enjoyed music, passionately, loudly, and with a cruelty that could be expressed as a spreadsheet. On a Tuesday that rained like it had a grudge, Bix shifted a crate that shouldn't have been where it was. It thunked, a sound like dignity falling off a shelf. Inside the warped wooden slat of the crate was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and a note, browned at the edges, written in a hand that reminded Orson of an old storybook. Neat, slanted, and dangerous. "Oi," Bix said, because one always began treasure hunts by saying "oi" first. "We've got paper." The note was concise and smelled faintly of lemon and old money, disappointment already arming itself against excitement. The script read, "D. Keep under ice. 2 notches east of the willow by the 4th lock. Not to be touched until I return. VD." They all read it twice, then again for the punctuation. "VD?" Net said. "That's Vash Dromek," Corliss supplied, immediately regretting the show and tell of information. "You've heard of him? Eastern Docks. Used to run everything from extortion to greyhound betting that collapsed into something with more shrapnel." Orson squinted as if he could reconstruct the past by looking at the letter forms. "He's in prison, isn't he? Serving the kind of sentence that starts with, 'You'll never,' and ends with, 'Get out,'" Bix said. He smiled then, a dangerous, hopeful thing. Imagine if this actually leads to money. The idea of money, unearned and legible enough to be hidden in a note, rearranged their faces. It softened Gideon's bark and brightened Zadie's sarcasm like someone had flicked a switch. They did not tell Gideon. You did not tell Gideon if your plan involved him in any way that might mean he'd take a cut or punish you for dreaming, or both. Instead, they pocketed the note into Bix's lunchbox and spent 90 minutes inventing plausible reasons for being seen near the old crate. "Inventory audit," Net said, with a straightness that made Zadie wonder whether she was an actor in a play she hadn't auditioned for. At the pub that night, the upright anchor full of men picking the grain of their boredom like a scab, their plans thrummed. Strange comedic suggestions fought their way to the top. Bury the money in the office garden and divide it weekly. Build a new life in Portugal. No visas, but a good attitude. Buy Hemswick and immediately sack Gideon. This was Bix's favorite. They never expected to be the only ones reading old, yellowed notes. They never expected that Dromek would be paroled. The possibility of millions, real, cold, machine-counted millions, becomes addictive in a place where overtime had become a myth. Their first clue sent them to places that were almost, but not quite, right. 2 notches east of the Willow. East by what? The Willow in the old municipal park had been cut down in 2007. The locks were all too new, the ice house long converted into a vegan cafe that sold smoothies and regret. They misread addresses, were locked out of alleyways, were asked for money at a canal, and once, to their humiliation, interrupted a funeral procession because Net was convinced the minister was bearing a willow wreath and that it might, with miraculous coincidence, contain a hidden compartment. Between the pratfalls, they found human truth. Corliss, who'd lived in a flat the size of a misplaced teabag, admitted he'd been taking his sister's calls from a blocked number because gambling debts made him small in ways he hadn't explained. Orson confessed he was writing, really writing, and that the cash would mean a postcard from the life he wanted to sketch into being. Zadie wanted to leave the monotony and open something called a shop that sells pens and would not be cruel. Net had saved money in jars and stacks of cryptic spreadsheets where she called each spreadsheet optics and laughed when she said it. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Orson said one cold night as they sat beneath a bus shelter eating cold pies. They regretted. We're playing at being outlaws, and we've got Gideon to deal with at dawn. Outlaws who can't help but make lists, Bix said, producing a crumpled A4 with doodles of a map that could have been interpreted as a treasure island or a rejected modern art exhibit. Lists are useful. Lists mean we sound organized. The comedy threaded through them, but something else began to move in their periphery. A van that seemed to be in more places than coincidence allows. It carried a logo that suggested courier services, but smelled like muscle memory and discretion. On the 3rd week of their idle archaeology, a man with a face like a broken pound coin and phone numbers tattooed under his jaw began asking about them, not in a way that invited answers, but in a way that demanded stories. He was a prick of attention on their lives. It was Net who discovered Dromek's release. She had a talent for 3 things: breaking into otherwise inconsequential Wi-Fi networks, obtaining the news annoyingly early, and making everyone else feel like they were lagging by minutes. On a Wednesday that tasted like lemon rind, her phone chimed and the news blinked. Vash Dromek, parole granted. Release date in 2 weeks. The air in their little team changed, jokes sharpened. The van's appearances began to mean purpose. The note in Bix's lunchbox stopped being a relic and started to be evidence of a timeline. He's going to want it back, Corliss said one night, voice thin. He had been quieter lately. He'd been meeting people in the delay between shifts, sometimes returning late with his hair smudged. There were new messages on his phone, messages he would delete if anyone asked to see. If he knows it's even been touched. He's not going to know, Bix said, though he sounded less certain pronouncing it than the sentence looked on the paper. We can be ahead of him. We can. The plan became a machine. It was not sophisticated. It involved a borrowed van, a map drawn by Orson that felt like an invitation, Net's ability to map open CCTV blind spots, Zadie's talent for stealing the correct keys and disguising their path with a smell of bleach and nostalgia. They moved at night, cursing each trap like an old absurd sport. There were near misses. Gideon's unexpected show at the depot where he came to check the inventory and nearly discovered a crate with their footprints inside. An encounter with a policeman who turned out to be an off-duty man interested in darts and curious about their late-night tea consumption. Betrayal first smells like indecision. Corliss's betrayal bloomed like that, small, vague, then sharp. He started arriving with stories that required numbers to be paid. He would stand in doorways and say things like, "There's someone I know," and "they can help," and in the same breath he would avoid looking any of them in the face. After a week of tight smiles and thinner lies, he met with the van's driver in an underpass, and Orson followed him. He told the rest of them, breathless and honest, and they argued, loud, theater of small persons, ugly, and decided to forgive because they were not killers and because they at least wanted to remain friends until Dromek's shadow passed. They were not safe. That was the lesson that hit when the murder happened. It had been a ridiculous plan. Get into an abandoned ice house to check under ice, literal ice, because the note had been the kind of thing that did not typically enjoy metaphor. The ice house had been converted into storage of sports equipment, and a team of community volunteers had marked it with really sincere flyers. They entered at night. Orson liked the way the echo made their laughter belong to history. Something metallic caught the light. A body, collapsed on a pallet of old ice molds, had been there longer than their noses suggested. It was not a mistake of mistaken identity or an accident. The corpse had a single stab wound, clean and professional. The pockets were empty, and the camera they'd left just a row back had a smashed lens. They called the police. They stood in the drizzle while uniforms wrote things that made them feel very conspicuous. Someone whispered that Dromek's people didn't like trespassers. Someone else said, "Hire someone reckless," in the wrong breath. The policeman looked at them in a way that meant he suspected all of them, and none of them equally, and went away with the efficient avoidance of a man who understood complicated human folds. Orson was quieter after that night. He had found the body. He had seen something the rest had missed. A tattoo at the base of the dead man's neck. A tiny juddering emblem that matched an insignia in photographs of Dromek's crew. The murder was a warning. It also had been a coincidence and a story, and they kept trying to make meaning of it because meaning comforts. Corliss began to change. He took longer to return calls from his sister. He left messages on the team thread that made no sense. Zadie found a receipt in his locker for a number that would buy many things: 2 plane tickets to somewhere warm, an advance payment for a handshake, and the team had to decide whether to turn him in or turn him out. The decision came at 3 in the morning, sticky and expensive with tears. They confronted him. He admitted everything with the kind of honesty that looked like shame and debt. They forgave him again, practicality, because Dromek would be out soon, and because friendships in the sort of places that smell of glue were forged in pragmatic alliances. Gideon, blissfully unaware of their delicates, went about ruining everyone's Monday as usual. He announced redundancies in a meeting with a pie chart and a smile like a saw. They all sat through it and felt their futures folding into manageable, miserly paper. It sharpened the plan again. The final night of the hunt arrived with all the wrong cues, an alley with puddles that reflected neon, the hum of a street that was aware of the wrongness of their joy. They broke into a long disused warehouse at the far side of the docks because the note, when placed on the map and measured with a constancy that Net liked, suggested there was an ice chest hidden under a dead dock crane 2 notches east of a willow that someone had replanted, and east, for once, was a compass word. They found a hatch beneath the crane. It smelled of old pigeons and salt. Inside was a trunk. Their heads were full of the movie they could make. New names, borrowed lives, the sound of Gideon's jaw hitting a resignation form. Bix's hands trembled like a ferret. They opened the trunk together. There were bundles, stacks of banknotes with a hush like 1,000 small birds. They were real. They were professional. They were, in a pinch, life. For 3 heartbeats, they were in a film. Then a small thing happened which undid the film. There was a hiss, a soft, theatrical sound, and from beneath the top layer of notes, a card slid out like a tongue. It read, in the same neat, dangerous hand as the first note, "Not yet. Look where the water bends and the clock used to swing. V.D." They laughed first, then cursed, then wept in a way that was small and helpless and perfectly pathetic. They had the money within reach and could not touch it. It was an invitation again, an elusive cat. Someone had moved it, or someone was watching the way their fingers shook. A phone buzzed. Net answered. It was a single news alert. Vash Dromek released today. He would be arriving somewhere, sometime. The van with the courier logo, their friend who had been following their lives like a bad plot, appeared at the far gate like a punished god. They were terrified, and the terror had a funny, familiar ring to it because it was mixed with the one thing they had let themselves hope for. They lifted the bundles anyway, lifting them like a confession. The crispness of money is its own language. In the end, they left the trunk alone. The note did what the note always did. It turned their certainty into a question. They walked out with nothing but the knowledge that they had been led this far, and with the new clue folded carefully into Net's wallet. Corliss, who had been trembling like a whale, held back tears. Tears for debt, for shame, for all the wrong decisions. Orson said gently, "Someone will write about this night," and it sounded like an omen and a promise. On their way past the gate, an unmarked car idled. A man with a face like a broken pound coin and phone numbers tattooed under his jaw stepped out. "You have something that belongs to my employer," he said, in a voice that was polite and his palms were not. The group, in a silent show of solidarity that had been stolen from long, quiet wars, stepped between the man and the gate. They were not professionals. They were a line of people who had learned to be more brave than brave felt like. The man left after a negotiation that involved a lot of bluff and an act of holding your breath long enough to feel dizzy. He warned them of consequences, gaslighted their courage, threatened names they had never heard. They went home. In the days that followed, Gideon announced new policies. Corliss vanished for a week and then returned with sunburn and callus. Orson began to write more feverishly and kept his old camera in a drawer like a small god. Zadie took more risks at work and began hiding small, expensive pens in the margins of the ledger she used to plan a pen shop. Net printed a map and wrote coordinates in the margins and did not tell anyone which ones were fanciful. The final scene was always their favorite. They huddled in the break room beneath a poster about workplace safety, passing the second note between them like contraband and reciting lines from the world's cheapest heist movies. There was no glittering triumph. There was an ache, though, that had a clarity no salary ever gave. They had been part of something bigger than a Tuesday. They laughed, they cried, they made crude plans and better ones. They considered starting again because now they had the map, and the map had the smell of a future. When the reader on the last page imagines them finally unlocking the trunk of unimaginable money, the truth is the same and the opposite. They did find the trunk. They did find stacks of notes, but they did not leave with cash in hand. They left with a new note, Vash's handwriting, promising nothing and promising possibility, and the cold, clean knowledge that the game was not over. The last line is not triumphant, it is only an invitation. 2 notches east of the willow, Net murmured, folding the note into her palm. We go again. Outside, Gideon lit a cigarette in a place that invited condemnation. The van stayed in the dock's shadow like a patient animal. The night folded into itself, and somewhere the crime boss, newly released and probably wearing the sort of suit that announces both taste and business, was stepping into air that smelled of salt and patience. He had a map, too. So did they. So did the city, with all its gulleted corners and generous wrong turns. The thing about plans that smell like promise is that they are always a little bit about who you are when you make them. The main guys had not found their millions. They had found one another, a note, and a reason to leave Hemswick's fluorescent lights behind. That, in the end, felt like both losing and winning. And in the trunk, beneath the top layer, a second card lay snug as a pulse awaiting the touch of nervous fingers. Please like and subscribe.